Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Carter Neely. I'm the director for the Landmarks Foundation of Montgomery. And this is the first session of Cultural Crossroads 2021, where we're taking a focus on Reconstruction in Alabama. That's a little bit different than what Cultural Crossroads has done in the past. It's usually looking at early Alabama, but we decided to kind of take a look at after what Alabama was like after the Civil War and approaching Reconstruction. And tonight we've got the guy who basically wrote the book on Reconstruction in Alabama, Michael Fitzgerald. I really appreciate you being here, Michael. And then also we've got Dr. Elijah Gaddis at Auburn University, who sits on our board and chairs our education committee. Elijah, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I want to do a quick introduction of Dr. Michael Fitzgerald, just to emphasize what Collier has said. Despite being a Californian turned Minnesotan, Dr. Fitzgerald is one of the experts on Reconstruction in the South, broadly, and in Alabama particularly. Among his books are Splendid Failure, Post-War Reconstruction in the American South, Urban Emancipation, Popular Politics and Reconstruction Mobile, and most recently, I think, 2017's Reconstruction in Alabama from Civil War to Redemption in the Cotton South. In pre-pandemic times, right, we'd have the big sort of table by the door with copies of the book where you could buy them. But unfortunately, that's not possible tonight. But what is possible is to go to Amazon, LSU Press, IndieBound, any number of other places and pick up the book, which I urge everyone to do. It is, as Collier said, the book on Reconstruction in Alabama, and I think a really good read. Our without a doubt the best and fullest history of Reconstruction in this state. The pandemic, of course, does have its advantages, which means, namely, that Professor Fitzgerald is able to join us tonight from Minnesota, where he teaches at St. Olaf College, and so we're really delighted to kick off this series with this conversation with Michael Fitzgerald. So, welcome, Mike.
Thank you for the generous introduction.
Yeah, thanks. So. I'm just going to be asking some questions, and hopefully if folks have things they want to weigh in towards the end, we can do that. But we'll get started with what I think is a kind of fundamental part of your book, Mike. In fact, it's in the title. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the Civil War shaped the process of Reconstruction in Alabama.
Well, having just seen Mills Thornton walk into the room, suddenly I feel morally obliged to be smart. But Alabama is, behind Confederate lines almost entirely, or the lower three quarters of the states is behind Confederate lines throughout almost all of the war. And the Tennessee Valley and adjacent areas that undergo Union occupation, that it's not consistent. So there's none of Alabama that is consistently held by the Union Army throughout the war. And I think that's one of the distinguishing characteristics of it, is that it's one of the more secure southern states. Remind me of the original question. What was the original question?
About how the process of occupation and the fighting of the war in Alabama helped shape Reconstruction.
Well, slavery in most of the state is relatively intact, eroding, but emancipation comes to the bulk of the African-American population in the spring and summer of 1865, even after the war ends. And that's kind of important. And the experience in the Tennessee Valley, which is fought over and fought over and fought over and fought over from 1862 to 1865, is very different, because slavery is really scrambled in North Alabama, and its experience is kind of different. I was going to say, and one of the things that you get is Let's just kind of do this with some maps, okay, just to give you a sense of how different the North Alabama experience is. So folks know the general pattern of Alabama's geography, the Black Belt with large African-American populations, the mountain, the Appalachian area with much larger white populations, and then the Tennessee Valley at the extreme north that has about 50-50. And that kind of colors the fact that the state responds very differently to the secession crisis. This is the vote on whether Alabama should, the vote on immediate secession. Black is against, light is for. And so the Black Belt is strongly supportive of immediate secession in the secession crisis. There's a lot of misgivings in North Alabama about how to secede, if to secede. And in the mountains, there's a fair amount of opposition to it. And I think that pattern kind of extends into the Reconstruction period. Because if you look at where whites vote for Reconstruction, it's pretty much, so the dark colors are whites voting for the Reconstruction Constitution. And it's pretty much a very similar map to the previous opposition to secession. So there is a contingent of whites who are really unenthusiastic about being drafted, seceding, the whole process in North Alabama. And it makes North Alabama a kind of like a cauldron of violence during the war. All the occupations, all the guerrilla activities, and then that kind of bleeds right into the Klan in the years after, after Reconstruction starts. And so you get kind of a North Alabama, South Alabama distinction that goes way back into the history of the state.
Things I like so much about your book is that it sort of pushes back, or the most recent book especially, is it kind of pushes back a little bit about where we think about the origins of Reconstruction beginning, both in terms of its kind of immediate ties to the Civil War, but then also the kind of varieties of Reconstruction as it unfolded as a process in the South. So I wondered if you could say from your opinion, from your research, how and when does Reconstruction actually begin in Alabama?
I would also say that I'm sure Mills is perfectly willing to jump in on some of this stuff, but okay. Alabama, I don't think there's a square foot of Alabama that the Union occupies consistently throughout almost all the war. I mean, they keep recapturing the Tennessee Valley and then abandoning it. So there's discussion of reconstructing the state beginning in like late 63, when President Lincoln issues his 10% plan, which says that as soon as 10% of the white population is willing to declare themselves loyal, we will start the process of Reconstruction. And there's discussion of that, especially since Sherman's actually threatening in public mass confiscations and mass executions. His letters are ferocious. And so the idea that we better reconstruct or else is kind of present in the occupied Tennessee Valley, but there's also tremendous opposition. It's an area where there's lots of guerrilla activity opposing the Union occupation. And so I guess what I would say is that Reconstruction never really gets off the ground. The 10% plan never takes effect, although they're talking about it, until the spring of 1865, when things do start beginning to move. But for the rest of the state, it really doesn't come until the Union Army arrives. And, in general, in the Black Belt, most planters don't free their slaves until the Union Army shows up on their doorstep. So I have people being held as slaves until June and July or later of 1865. They literally don't do it until they have to.
One of the audiences we really want for this is high school teachers in Alabama. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the sort of peculiarities or particularities, maybe is a better word, of Reconstruction in Alabama on a sort of statewide level in comparison to other states in the South?
I kind of think of Alabama as my representative Deep South state. I think it may be the one with the least peculiarities in terms of its general evolution. Peculiarities. It has a lot of diversity, like a lot of the South's diversity. You have North Alabama, you have areas that kind of look like East Tennessee or Eastern or Western North Carolina. You have a major city. I think Mobile must be like the third biggest city in the Confederacy. And then you have the Black Belt, which is a major cotton producer. So you have this highly varied state that covers a lot of the South's diversity. The other thing that's kind of interesting is I think it's the state in the South. The thing that is unique that's kind of interesting is it has the most concentrated Black population. Mm. I think the percentage of African Americans living in areas that are over 2/3 Black is actually higher than any other state, I believe. So it's, I played around with the census and came up with that. So the areas that are the primo Black Belt counties are predominantly African American, and that kind of colors how things develop, because it's kind of hard to have a major persistent Klan presence or lots of Klan activity in areas where African Americans are 3/4 of the population. There are some places like that, but in general, it's so disruptive that a lot of planners are not pursuing that very eagerly.
Yeah. Return to something you said, sort of earlier about emancipation, right? That kind of uneven, unfolding, I suppose, of emancipation. What kind of impact does that have with all the other changes that are sort of happening in this immediate post-war Alabama?
Well, in the Tennessee Valley, the Union occupation is prolonged enough and harsh enough from the point of view of planters that in the Tennessee Valley, by the middle of the war, most planters realize that slavery is gone, that they are not going to be able to get it back. And the only way they can get freedmen back to work and newly freed slaves back to work is to offer them wages or offer them a share of the crop or something. So that tenant farming is actually happening in some places in the Tennessee Valley, like by the end of the war, where people are renting, white people are renting land to the ex-slaves. None of that's happening in the Black Belt, where pretty much what's going on is that planters are trying to maintain slavery-style production, because they're used to it, and so the Black codes, they want the whole slavery system back if they can get it with wage labor. They want gang labor. They want tight supervision. They want women in the fields. They want kids in the fields, and they want to withhold the wage till the end of the year so nobody can leave or shop around for better wages. And so I guess what I would say here is that one of the things that colors Reconstruction is that there's a real struggle for how freedom is going to be on the plantations in the Black Belt. And it makes what happens with military Reconstruction more contentious on the plantations as African Americans start becoming politically active.
Can I ask, just as a sort of follow-up and largely for my own edification and interest, I mean, do we see, are there any regions or particular examples in Alabama that you know of where we see a kind of unique labor experiment of the type that we see, say, on the former Davis plantations in Mississippi or anything like that? I'm wondering, I guess I'm asking that in part because I'm just wondering, if there are in this immediate sort of post-war period, if there are some of the seeds for that kind of future labor history of Alabama, right?
I think that there are some refugee camps in the Tennessee Valley and some people that are renting land from the government that has been at least temporarily seized. But I think that because the Union Army keeps losing control of the Tennessee Valley, all of those are periodically wiped out. Because remember, Hood marches through there in like November 1864, and then he loses at Christmas time in Nashville, and then stilters back through the region. And so everybody African American and all the Union refugees that are congregating there, because there are Unionists congregating in large numbers in the Tennessee Valley, they flee the Confederate Army. And so I can't think of anything like Davis Bend or there's not a lot of communal purchase opportunities the way, because the Union Army doesn't, that's the other thing, the Union Army only occupies Alabama really late, which means no confiscated lands. Yeah. Because President Johnson is pardoning everybody in sight. And even the Union commander of the Freedmen's Bureau at that time, Wager Swain, just abandons the idea that anybody's going to get any.
That I think you've begun to emphasize tonight is how differently Reconstruction plays out in different regions of Alabama, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, what the process and experience of Reconstruction was like in sort of different regions of Alabama. A big question, I know. But.
Well, one of the arguments of the book is that African Americans get the right to vote, that the terrorist response, the spread of the Klan just about the time that Alabama is admitted as a state, or just before Alabama is admitted to a state under Reconstruction, under Black suffrage, that about half the state, where the numbers are relatively even, the Klan is pretty pervasive. So the whole Tennessee Valley has a very pronounced Klan presence. The areas immediately surrounding it have a fair amount, and then kind of up the western border of the state, had Tuscaloosa, Sumter County, Livingston, the area out towards Meridian. So there are areas where the Klan is pervasive, but most of the rest of the Black Belt, the numbers are so lopsided, and the threat of African American resistance that they will fight back, or random retaliation, that's enough to deter a fair number of planters from eagerly embracing the Klan until it seems expedient. And so you get this sort of situation where, because, in the Black Belt, they figured out once the shift to sharecropping occurs, they figure out they can make money merchandising to freedmen. And they can, if freedmen go back to work as tenants, they can make a lot of money selling them goods on credit. And that's important to people for whom they can get themselves back on their feet after 6, 7, 8 years of chaos. So I guess my argument is that you have this kind of North Alabama is just rampant violence for years, more episodic in the central and eastern Black Belt. And the thing is that most African Americans live in places where they have lots of numbers to protect themselves with. Yeah. And I think that's part of the argument, that they can deter a lot of pervasive terrorist activity for a long time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, you write a lot about, and of course, there's been lots written elsewhere about this kind of white terrorism and about its institutionalization, right, in some ways. And I wonder how does a sort of influence of kind of institutionalized or organized white terror in these parts of Alabama where it is particularly prominent, how does that compare to, say, the ongoing influence of governmental institutions that are also there, whether it's Freedmen's Bureau or whatever, in terms of how Reconstruction is being shaped? So I guess what I'm asking is, are there places where the Klan is every bit as influential on the sort of local situation as, say, the U.S. government?
Oh yeah, I mean, there are the whole Tennessee Valley, lots of violence. Tuscaloosa, the Klan pretty much shuts down the university and drives the college president and some of the professors into exile. The western border, Sumter County, Pickens County, the area right there is just like dozens of people murdered. So it's kind of variable, but I wouldn't minimize it. The Alabama has a fairly severe Klan episode, and I guess the argument is that the planters at the time when cotton pays well are less enthusiastic, and then when the Depression hits in '73, just the situation changes dramatically at that point, and the violence just escalates all over the place. Yeah. And so I think you could make an argument that that the one thing that's mitigating the violence is the setting and the profitability of plantation agriculture when it is successful. And so the thing that I conclude with is that from the fall of 1871 till pretty much the spring of '74, maybe even the summer, there are no big race riots in Alabama for like 2.5 years. And then the Depression hits, and the '74 campaign comes and just.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting argument because it I work on lynching, and so obviously we start seeing activists making this same argument about the economic roots of racial violence in the late 19th century, right? And so I think that early sort of causal linkage is really interesting. But you and I are not here just to have a conversation about things we're interested in completely.
I would also say, by the way, in terms of violence, I think that there's a lot of violence immediately after the war on the Black.
Yeah.
I think that planters are so used to hitting people, and they're so frustrated by the loss of all that property and the loss of control, and they're afraid and they feel betrayed, and they're just used to hitting people when they cross them. So, but especially when they're not making any money, that's their default behavior. But within a few years, sharecropping becomes common. They start making some money. And a few years have gone by, and they that behavior becomes less common among them, I think, on the plantation. Because if you're not working under an overseer anymore, the circumstances on a day-to-day basis has changed if you're a sharecropper.
Yeah. So I wondered if we can move a bit off the plantation and think about the sort of that first generation of Black politicians in Alabama, and that first kind of generation of political gains. Can you comment on the situation of Black sort of political representation in more local instantiations, local offices versus statewide or national?
Okay, I can actually. Well, first of all, Alabama has one unique thing in terms of its political history. In a lot of states, Reconstruction rule is uninterrupted, in fact, almost everywhere else. But in Alabama, there's a big railroad scandal and a big Klan episode, and the Republicans get voted out in November 1870, and Democrats come in, and they handle the railroad corruption issue and the railroad bond issue that the Republicans are passing. They manage to bankrupt by refusing to pay off fraudulent government endorsement of railroad bonds for the biggest railroad company in the state, the one that runs between like Chattanooga and Birmingham and beyond. What they did was manage to bankrupt 20, 30, 40 railroads by refusing to honor the bonds. And so there's a catastrophic thing under the Democrats. And then there's a gigantic railroad scandal as one of the companies tries to bribe the governor's best friend. So the Democrats have a catastrophic railroad scandal of their own, and they get voted out. And so in 1872, the Republicans win the state by a substantial margin and come back into power. And I think that interruption with the Democrats in power undermines African-American demands for office, because the people that get elected in 1872, they're all native white Southerners. They're all native white Alabamans. And so I think it takes it takes away from the trajectory of Black demands for more offices and civil rights laws that you would find in some place like Louisiana or South Carolina, where the Republicans are in power for almost a decade. Mississippi too. Does that make sense? So my sense is actually that the African Americans, having lost one major election and being overjoyed to have the Klan killing stop, are more cautious about their demands than elsewhere, except for one candidate. I think everybody on the state Republican ticket all the way through is, I believe, white. There's only one African American, I think, on the state ticket, and that's James Rapier, who eventually is going to go to Congress. But so my sense is that the African American leadership is actually quite cautious relative to other states. Alabama's schools are segregated from the beginning, public schools. That never changes. The University of Alabama is segregated from the beginning. And not just segregated, Blacks are excluded. And that never really changes. So they are much more cautious. And Alabama never passes a state civil rights law. So that I think that's kind of the distinctiveness, is how careful the Black leadership is to try and keep some white allies on board, which is probably why these railroad laws are getting passed, because they're shopping for white votes is what's going on. Is that a
Yeah, no, that's useful. I mean, just as a follow-up, to what extent were there Black office holders in, say, local municipal?
Yeah. Here's what I would say about that. And I don't know, Mills may know, but here's my sense. Local governance, if you're going to be a probate judge, if you're going to be a sheriff, if you're going to be a local tax collector, you have to put up big bonds. Yeah. Like big bonds, $25,000, $50,000 bonds, because you're handling a lot of money. And that gives the few whites who are sympathetic to the Republicans, if they have money, they kind of have veto power over local officials. And so I have African Americans getting elected to sheriff and being unable to take office because they couldn't raise. No one would front the money for them to take office. And so what ends up happening is African Americans run for jobs that don't have bonding requirements. And what are they? The legislature. Yeah. The legislature has no bonding requirements. Congress has no bonding requirements. And so I think that what happens is the African Americans get shoved into the positions that are visible, but also play. Did that make sense as an explanation for what's going on? I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. So, I wanted to think a little bit about this sort of the kind of end of Reconstruction and what comes after. We're terming this whole series Reconstruction and its legacies, right? And you have from authors I know hate to be quoted to the back of themselves unless the sentence is really good, and this is a good one. You have towards the end of the book, all that remained of Reconstruction was the memory of the era, who to blame for its failings, and how the era should be interpreted. And I think I really like that sentiment. So what I wanted to ask you was, how did people at the time, at the end of Reconstruction in Alabama, how did they answer that question? How did they interpret this era?
Well, a couple things. The mainstream Democratic position is that that Black suffrage means bankruptcy, radicalism, high taxes, chaos. And so this is what happens if racial equality, this is what happens when the federal government messes with us. This is what happens when the federal government enforces civil rights legislation. And so this enormously pushes people. I think that the hard line of Alabama that Alabama takes all the way up to George Wallace is colored by a particularly strong emphasis on how bad Reconstruction in Alabama had been. And the best example of that is my predecessor, the last guy who wrote a full-scale history of Alabama and Reconstruction, Walter Fleming, whose book is really an apology for the Klan. And the chapter on the Klan is admiring. And in the introduction to a Klan memoir that he edited and edited and reissued, he pretty makes clear that he thinks that the Klan terrorism was necessary to prevent Black people from voting. It's pretty much a flat-out endorsement. And that hard line, the hard line of the Dunning School, kind of infuses the hard line. This is their fright. This is their fright mask going forward. And the way it gets spun is that the scalawags who were racially moderate, like Governor William H. Smith, were so much better and much more acceptable to Alabamans than the carpetbaggers that are lining up with Black people.
What comes next, or what's still needed for our understanding of history of Reconstruction in Alabama? What are the books or studies that we really need?
Well, I'm not sure what the current historical moment, where the new Reconstruction scholarship is going to go, given Black Lives Matter, given the changes in American society. Certainly Reconstruction is on people's minds now because, 1876 is the last wildly contested election like this. So I'm not quite sure because, I kind of see my interpretation as kind of, and on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of an attempt to give a fair interpretation of what African American leadership is trying to achieve and what they do achieve. And I don't know that, I think that the current moment may want a harder edged version of Reconstruction. So we may get a new revisionism.
Yeah, and maybe they'll find a harder edged Reconstruction. I think that's an interesting sort of supposition, right? Of what could happen and what could be out there. I want to sort of end with maybe the most difficult question, but and a big one. I wonder if you could talk about what you think the most lasting political implications of Reconstruction in Alabama are.
Okay. Two things. I think that it's hard because it gives the push in the direction of reaction. Like the push in the direction of reaction in Alabama is so strong, getting us to the 1901 Constitution where they disfranchised like 98% of the African American population. I think that push is one of the legacies of Reconstruction, which you could argue that kind of pushes the extremism that characterizes the state's leadership as they walk into this buzzsaw of Selma and Birmingham and Montgomery. That this particular memory of Reconstruction, this hardline memory of Reconstruction, is one thing that pushes it onward. It's hard to say that Reconstruction is a success, but what I would say is there's certain things that are important that come out of it. One thing is the Great Reaction. But Reconstruction gets us African American access to public schools, segregated access, but it doesn't go away. And if you think about the role of education in where the Black leadership and the following of the civil rights movement came from, when it emerges, how much of it is people who are now literate, people who can now follow the news, people, it's a different Black community that confronts racism in the 40s, 50s, 60s than it is of a 95% illiterate and destitute African American population who fight pretty heroically in the 1860s, 70s for basic civil rights. But so that's one thing. The other thing is that the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments passed during that Reconstruction interregnum. I cannot imagine the 14th and 15th Amendments passing at any time since. I can't imagine the 14th Amendment passing now. Yeah, it's in the news all the time, right? And so if you don't have a 14th Amendment, you don't have a 15th Amendment, where do you get the Brown decision? Where do you get the civil rights litigation? Where does that come from unless the constitutional sanction is ironclad? Because when they run into resistance, the tendency for the courts to back off is pretty strong. But how do you get a civil rights movement without the Brown decision? And how do you get then how do you get people into the streets? How do you get the sense of that history is on their side? So there are some things that come out of Reconstruction that, even though there are people that argue to the contrary, I kind of can't imagine a modern civil rights movement without the strong constitutional sanction. And I would also say that the terrorist tradition on the other side comes out of Reconstruction and it's enormously strengthened, and that is another thing. So I would say that the more successful part of Reconstruction, the thing that strikes me as more successful are some of the social developments. African Americans break with the holders of slavery, like gang labor, whips, overseers, being in a subordinate role in all these white churches. They establishing their own churches, establishing their own community. Sharecropping, as badly as it works out financially, allows more autonomy, more individual. It's different from slavery. It's different from neo-slavery. It's something that has more possibility of clawing your way out of